Hello everybody, my name is Steve Train. I'm the Governor's appointee from the state of Maine, and I'm the new chair of the Lobster Board. I'd like to welcome everybody to the meeting today. We happen to be the first meeting of the winter meeting this year, and so I'd like to welcome everybody to our winter meeting. I assume everybody got the paperwork in the mail, or the electronic paperwork, or whatever you want to call it. The first item on our agenda is board consent for the agenda. Is there any opposition to the agenda as sent to you? Seeing none, it's approved with consent. Everybody have the proceedings from the October meeting? Are there any additions, deletions, corrections? If not, we'll consider that approved with consent. Seeing no opposition, we'll call that approved. We have nobody signed up for public comment. If somebody missed an opportunity to sign up and they have something to comment on that is not on the agenda, please raise your hand, come up and introduce yourself. This is going fast. Okay, now before we get into the guts of the agenda, I have one thing. There seems to be a lot of whale discussion driving management in the lobster industry right now, or at least impending management. We have a whale discussion coming on the policy board later. I would like to try as much as possible to keep it out of the discussion in today's meeting. It's not a direct agenda item. And if possible, withhold whale comments that aren't actually pertinent to what we're doing. Pat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, but I do have a comment and possibly a pending motion as it relates to whales and the Law Enforcement Committee that I would like to address at the prior to the completion of the meeting.
It's pertinent to law enforcement then, and we'll bring it in then. Thank you. Okay, it's time to get started. We have addendum 26 for lobster and addendum 3 for Jonah crab. It's a final action, and we're going to be started off with summaries from Megan Ware. Megan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll just wait for the presentation to get pulled up. But just an overview of what we're going to talk about today. I'll open up with the problem statement. I will quickly review the management options, and then I'll review the public comment that we received on this document, and then that will be followed by a Law Enforcement Committee report as well as an AP report. So just as a reminder, there are two primary concerns that this addendum is trying to address. The first is that current harvester reporting requirements do not provide the level of information needed to respond to management issues. And more specifically, the spatial information we're collecting is too coarse to respond to management actions. There's a lack of information on the depth of the fishery coast-wide, and then not all harvesters are required to report. And the second concern is that the lobster fishery, as the lobster fishery is moving further offshore and the Jonah crab fishery is expanding in federal waters, this is a concern because the majority of our biological sampling is occurring inshore or near shore. And as a reminder, the technical committee in their report commented that many of the statistical areas are not meeting the 3 sample per season baseline, which is in the stock assessment, which means that we need to be borrowing data from different statistical areas, and that our greatest data gaps are in offshore Georges Bank. And then before getting into the management options, I thought I'd just review the TC analysis on the percent harvester reporting in Maine. So as a reminder, the board did task the TC with investigating a statistically valid sample of harvester reporting. And there were 3 primary conclusions from that TC report. The first is that overall, the TC is recommending 100% harvester reporting to accurately account for all trap hauls and the spatial extent of effort. However, in the interim, the current 10% harvester reporting in Maine is sufficiently precise, in large part due to the size of the fishery. So what this means is that that 10% harvester reporting is resulting in a low coefficient of variation for metrics such as trap hauls and landings. The TC also had a recommendation to improve the current 10% reporting by focusing on active permit classes, which contain a large number of vessels and have a high variance of landings. So focusing on active permit holders as opposed to latent permits, and that's going to be option B on the next slide. So issue 1 is the percent harvester reporting, and there are 3 options here. Option A is status quo, so we maintain the minimum of 10% harvester reporting with an expectation of 100% reporting over time. If a state is at 100% reporting, it maintains that percentage. Option B is maintaining the current effort associated with reporting. So if a state is at 100% reporting, they maintain that percentage. If a state is at less than 100% harvester reporting, they maintain their current level of effort, but they redistribute their current sampling through that optimal approach, which is again from the TC report. And for this option, there is an expectation of 100% reporting over time through the use of electronic reporting. And finally, option C is 100% harvester reporting, and there are 2 sub-options here. Sub-option 1 is a straight 100% trip level reporting. Under sub-option 2, there's an exception for commercial harvesters who land less than 1,000 pounds of lobster and Jonah crab annually. They can submit monthly landing reports. And then since electronic reporting is mentioned in one of the options, I just remind everyone that electronic reporting is highly encouraged by the plan development team and the TC, given it is a cost-effective method to increase reporting, and there's flexibility to collect expanded data elements. The addendum is recommending the use of eTrips or eTrips Mobile, given it can be implemented at little to no cost to states. It's approved by GARFO for EVTRs, and there's a well-established relationship between ACCSP and ASMFC. However, states can use a different platform for electronic reporting, but it must be API compatible, which just means it has to allow data to be consolidated from other sources. Issue 2 is asking what data components harvesters are required to report. Under option A, again, status quo. So right now the plan requires things like statistical area, number of traps hauled, the species, the pounds. And options B and C provide ways to expand upon that. So under option B, the plan would also require depth, bait type, and soak time. And under option C, it would require number of traps per trawl and number of buoy lines. Again, these are the minimum baselines for all the states. Some states are already collecting some of this information, but it would just codify it in the plan. And for this issue, you can think of this issue as building blocks. So the board can choose option B, they can choose option C, or they can choose both. And finally, the third question is asking about the spatial resolution at which we collect data. There are 5 options here. Option A is statistical area, so that's our status quo. Option B is statistical area and LCMA. Option C is statistical area and distance from shore. So we have 0 to 3 miles would be our inshore region, 3 to 12 miles would be our nearshore region, and greater than 12 miles would be our offshore region. Option D is 10-minute squares, which are what are shown coastwide in the figure on this slide. And this is basically breaking down the statistical areas into smaller boxes. And then option E is for an electronic tracking pilot program. So as a reminder, this is a 1-year pilot program to test electronic tracking devices in the fishery. To do this, we would put together a subcommittee of board, plan development team, industry, and law enforcement members, and they would be charged with designing the pilot program as well as selecting the technologies. At the end of that 1 year, the technologies would be evaluated based on compliance, ability to determine trap hauling from steaming, industry feedback, cost. And at the end of that 1 year, the board has 3 options. They can choose to end the program and not pursue electronic tracking. They can extend the program for 1 year to test new technologies or test them in different areas, or they could pursue the implementation of tracking in the lobster fishery. And then just to wrap up some of the other changes that are included in the addendum, in terms of biological sampling, there is still a requirement for non-de minimis states to conduct either a ventless trap survey, a settlement survey, or a trawl survey. However, this addendum would set a minimum baseline for biological sampling. So states would be required to conduct a minimum of 10 sea or port sampling trips in the lobster Jonah crab fishery. And if a state comprises more than 10% of coastwide landings in either the lobster or Jonah crab fishery, they would be asked to do additional trips. And finally, there are 3 recommendations for federal waters. The first is to establish a harvester reporting requirement for that lobster-only federal permit. The second is to create a fixed gear VTR. And the third is to implement a targeted lobster sampling program in federal waters. Moving on to the public comment we received, there were 8 hearings held in 7 states with about 130 individuals attending those. And then we received 13 written comments. Most of them were from organizations including NGOs, industry associations, and the New England Council. And then the remaining were from individuals. So just to orient everyone, these are going to be the graphs I show for the 3 issues. On the left column, on the top is the written comments split out by individual versus organization, and then the public hearings are split out by state. And then on the top are the different options. So again, this is issue 1, percent harvester reporting. Overall, the greatest support was for maintaining the current harvester reporting effort, but allocating this through an optimal approach, so that option B, or the 10% modified on the screen. Much of the support for this option came from the Maine public hearings, as well as individual letters from Maine residents and several industry organizations. Comments in favor of this option included, it is the best use of Maine's time and money, 10% harvester reporting is statistically valid, and harvester reporting should focus on active permit holders. The 100% reporting, which is option C, was the second most supported option, with much of the comments coming from the New Hampshire and New York hearings, letters from NGOs, as well as the New England Council. Those who favored this option commented that all fishermen should be treated the same and be required to report. 100% reporting should be required from Maine, which comprises 83% of the fishery. 100% reporting is needed to address data gaps and understand the offshore movement of the fishery. And in particular, several NGOs recommended immediate adoption of 100% reporting rather than the 5-year phase-in approach that is outlined in the addendum. And finally, for option A, which is status quo, those who supported this option again commented that the 10% reporting is statistically valid, that 100% reporting is redundant given there's 100% dealer reporting, and it's a better use of Maine's budget to focus on biological sampling as opposed to harvester reporting. The next issue is the data elements. So again, we have status quo, and then option B was to add in effort and location elements, and option C were the gear elements. The greatest support was for status quo. At almost every hearing, participants commented that their state is collecting more data elements than what is required under the plan, and so they are already exceeding the plan requirements. However, there was resistance to requiring additional data elements in the plan, as participants generally commented that they're already providing enough data. In particular, there was little support for requiring bait type, and there were concerns with depth, given that a single trawl can cover a wide depth range. Those who supported the addition of data elements included NGOs, a few individuals at hearings, as well as the New England Council. They supported the additional data elements, particularly those gear elements, given the ongoing discussions regarding protected resources. And then finally, issue 3 was the spatial resolution of data. So overall, greatest support was for distance from shore, which is option C, as well as statistical area, option A. Much of the support came from the Maine public hearings, where fishermen are already reporting statistical area and distance from shore, so options A and C would not add additional requirements for those fishermen. The addition of 10-minute squares, option D, got moderate support at several hearings, as well as from several industry organizations, the New England Council, and NGOs. These participants commented that a greater spatial resolution of data is needed to show a history of where the lobster and Jonah crab fisheries are taking place. And importantly, many participants commented that fishermen should not be required to fill out a new trip report for every square fished, since this would significantly increase the burden on fishermen. And finally, several NGOs recommended immediate adoption of electronic tracking in the lobster fishery. Just to wrap up with some of the additional comments, in regards to the federal recommendations, there were 16 comments in support of 100% harvester reporting for federally permitted vessels, 7 comments in support of the fixed gear VTR, and then 3 comments in support of a targeted biological sampling program. Others did caution against increased observer coverage. Regarding protected resources, several NGOs recommended subsequent action to address the right whale deaths. And then at the New Jersey and Connecticut hearings, fishermen highlighted the economic impacts of the current season closures. In particular, they both talked about the requirement to remove gear, as that extends the length of the closure and prevents them from fishing for other species. And I will now pass it off for the LEC report.
Thank you, Megan. The Law Enforcement Committee did not have any specific recommendations for addressing the level of harvester reporting or the types of additional data that might be desirable or mandatory. The LEC supports efforts to collect as much data as possible, but offered the view that as reporting requirements become more complex with additional data needs, it would be unreasonable to expect strict enforcement of incomplete or incorrect reporting. Regulatory and enforcement standards for non-reporting are in place and effective. The LEC supports the development and improvement of vessel tracking and statistical area reporting as a means to enhance enforcement and management of the lobster fishery as a whole. While the usefulness of additional data collection for enforcement purposes may vary from state to state, there may be ancillary utility in having additional information at hand, such as water depths, bait types, and gear soak times. The LEC welcomes the opportunity to provide enforcement advice regarding the development of tracking and harvester reporting systems for the American lobster fishery.
Thanks, Renee. And then I will just wrap up with the advisory panel report. So I'm presenting this on behalf of the AP. The AP met via conference call on January 17th to review the management options, review the public comment that have been received to date, and then also provide recommendations to the board. On issue number 1, 5 AP members supported 100% reporting in federal waters. So there were comments that as the lobster fishery moves offshore, the data gaps in federal waters are becoming exacerbated. Of those 5 individuals, 2 AP members were comfortable with 10% harvester reporting in state waters, but the 100% reporting in federal waters. 2 separate AP members supported maintaining the current 10% harvester reporting requirement. There were comments that 10% harvester reporting is statistically valid, that Maine cannot handle 100% reporting given the number of trips, and that, again, 100% reporting would be redundant. One of these individuals did support option B, which is redistributing that 10% to focus on active permits. And then one AP member suggested either an optional or additional reporting program for recreational fishermen so that they can provide their knowledge and information to managers. For issue number 2, 4 AP members supported the redesign of the federal VTR to encompass data needs of the lobster fishery, with comments that the current form is not presented in a logical order, and that different fishermen are interpreting the data elements differently. On option B, which is the additional elements regarded to location and effort, one AP member supported inclusion of soak time, but did not see a need for bait type. And another AP member expressed concern about depth, again, given a trawl can span such a wide range of depths. And then for option C, which are the gear configuration elements, one AP member supported inclusion of these, given it's pertinent to the ongoing protected resources discussions. Finally, for issue 3, so regarding the electronic tracking pilot program, 5 AP members did not support this, commenting that eventually the cost will fall on fishermen and it's not appropriate for the inshore fishery. One AP member did support the exploration of electronic tracking for federal vessels, especially given increases in the Jonah crab fishery. Regarding the 10-minute squares, 2 AP members supported the use of the 10-minute squares as long as fishermen don't have to fill out a separate form for each square, with comments that this will help the fishery in the long run because it will provide a history of where the effort is taking place. And then one AP member supported stat area and LCMA, and one AP member did not support distance from shore, given Long Island Sound is all in state waters. And then just some additional comments. One AP member overall supported greater sampling of the whole fishery. One AP member highlighted the importance of reporting being fisherman-friendly, so logical and simple. And then one AP member cautioned the board against moving towards requirements that are found in the groundfish fishery. And with that, we'll take any questions.
Thank you, Megan. Do we have any questions? David Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just note, first off, congratulations on being the chairman. It's really refreshing to be over on the side of the table for this meeting. I have a question for the NOAA staff. There's a number of the points that are made both in the public hearings and in the document talk about revisions to the VTR, and I know that NOAA staff routinely do small revisions to the VTR system. So I'm just wondering how much flexibility there is to adjust the VTR language to try to address some of these concerns. If someone from NOAA could speak to that, I think it'd be beneficial.
Peter, I had to ask who it was. You were a shadow. Peter Burns, go ahead and answer, please.
Good. I hope you can see me a little bit better, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. As far as the flexibility, I mean, the forms are set up. I imagine over time, if we wanted to revise these forms, I mean, one of the options here, the recommendations, is to go forward with a fixed gear reporting form. But right now, if we were going to go forward with some more electronic reporting, there may be some more flexibility that way, and those are systems that we're trying to develop and working on. But right now, we would have to go through and change those forms. We'd have to go through a process to evaluate the burdens and things like that, and go through a significant administrative process to change the forms the way they are now.
Follow-up, David?
Yeah, just a quick question. Peter, in the past we've talked about having a fixed gear VTR system, and if my memory is correct, that always triggered some type of OMB requirement and review, which was not seen as being terribly probable. Is that still the case?
Peter, go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the question, David. Well, yeah, anytime we go through any types of changes that require changes in the burdens to the public and to the federal government to provide information, we have to go through a process. So, yes, we would have to go through and revise these forms. We'd have to give the rationale and the appropriate adjusted burdens and things like that, and we'd have to get approval from OMB to go through and actually implement these types of things. So, big or small, there's always any kinds of changes are going to have to require updated adjustments, updated evaluations of the burden, and we'd have to get approval of that up the line.
Thank you, Peter. Richie White? No? Do we have no other questions? Yes. Who is it? Mark Alexander.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up on some reporting questions, not on VTRs, but with state reporting, I think it's wise that the addendum takes the direction of looking toward electronic reporting, but in that regard, has there been any communication with or feedback from ACCSP on these additional data elements? Because some of them are not part of the present program design, and I would guess that that might involve some of the various committees in incorporating those data elements into the design and then subsequently have them translate into the electronic application itself. And I was just wondering if there's any idea how long that may take.
Yeah, so a member of ACCSP was on the plan development team for this addendum for that reason. And I, again, checked in with them on Friday, and they expressed to me their confidence to be able to implement whatever is chosen in this addendum, including the data elements. So I think that they're confident that they can do it.
Did they indicate a timeline?
I'll use a Menhaden phrase, cautiously optimistic for next fishing year.
Does anybody have anything else? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up on the ACCSP question, Jeff White, I think, is on his way over from the office. So if he gets here, you guys can ask him some of the more detailed questions. He might be able to help out. But he'll be here hopefully soon.
Trying to stay on task here. We've got reports, we've got reviews, and we're on to final approval, and yet we may need more information. If folks want to dig in deeper to the questions that were just posed to Megan, if they had, if they were concerned about her responses or needed more detail about data elements or timing and those sorts of things, Jeff may be able to do that. If folks around the table are satisfied, I think then you're ready to go full steam ahead. Thank you, Bob. So we're at the point where we have to consider final action unless people would like to wait for more information. And I don't see anyone raising their hand to make a motion. Dan McKernan.
Can I recommend that we take these one issue at a time?
Oh, that's fine. Pat Kelleher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure going in order may be the best approach from trying to determine. There's obviously going to be a lot of direction towards the state of Maine on our willingness to go beyond anything beyond 10%. There are both fiscal issues within the state of Maine that I think the board is aware of, and I think we have an option here in front of us that starts to improve on Maine's already utilization of 10% harvester reporting with a strong emphasis on the further development of electronic reporting. It would be good to have an ACCSP representative here, I think, as we get into the finer details of electronic reporting, because my staff continues to express concerns with me about the current E-trips and how it would have to have a lot of modification, I think, to work for the state of Maine because of the size of our fishery. But if it'll help move things along, I'll be happy to put a motion on the board, and we can go from there. So, if you will, Mr. Chairman, I would make a motion to move Option B, maintain current harvester reporting efforts and allocate reporting through the optimal approach. And if I get a second, I will give further justification.
We have a motion. Is there a second? We have a second from Jim Gilmore. Further discussion? Go ahead, Pat.
So there's been a lot of talk over the years, for many years, in regards to Maine's harvester reporting. Maine's fishery has nearly 6,000 commercial license holders that make up both the state and federal portion of our fisheries. Last year, there were 265,000 trips taken in that year, 292,000 trips in 2016. With our current 10%, our landings program selects 650 to 700 licensed harvesters a year to report. This is 10% is chosen from each zone and each license class category. We currently enter around 30,000 lobster records in a year, and I believe that it exceeds all of the rest of the jurisdictions put together with our 10%. The TC has determined that Maine's current 10% harvester reporting provides statistically representative data because of the large scale of our fishery. The CV, which is less than 5%, equates to a 95% confidence interval with the data associated with 10% reporting. So it is a very marginal benefit to increase to 100% at this time. The appropriate stratification of license class and zones could be worked upon, and we could deal specifically with making sure that we're sampling both active license holders, and we could also take out the recreational component from that. I think what the TC has recommended is to continue to further develop the electronic reporting. Maine is very, very supportive of that approach. I think we have a very good track record in the state of Maine as far as being leaders associated with electronic reporting. The elder fishery is a prime example of that, and I think something that should be looked at as it relates to this type of reporting, something that can be simplified. Everybody's carrying these damn things around, these smartphones around now that could be utilized for this type of reporting associated with daily landings. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll stop there, but I do know Senator Langley has some much greater detail as it pertains to the financial resources within the state of Maine and how anything beyond 10% could affect us. So it may be worthwhile hearing from the Senator.
Senator Langley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have just been in contact with our chair of our Appropriations Committee this morning just to make sure that my figures are correct. Our last economic forecast predicted about a $12 million surplus that we would go into this year to fund what's on the table, our appropriations table that were carried over from last session. I think the asks are probably 10 times what the money is. Our state has had to come up with a $2 million additional outside of the budget last year for the expansion, Medicaid expansion voted in by the voters, another $1 million plus for implementing ranked choice voting that's come in. And so we're extremely challenged in this, and they'll be turning over, every rock will be turned over to try to meet those needs. I don't know what it's like in your state, but or your states, but for legislators that are off the coast, there's probably not as much interest in what happens on the water. Those of us that live on the coast. And then as a perspective, less than 1% of the budget in Maine is from the Department of Marine Resources, and all natural resources departments are less than 3% of the budget. So, and it's very, very tightly watched. And the department also has some increases within that they have to absorb with increased prices for trap tags and such. So the extra $500,000 I don't see would be coming to the department, and if they had to increase the reporting mechanism, it would be at the sacrifice of some other, I would say, more worthy endeavors. And then the other thing that I might suggest is that you take, if you want an item to take a look at, if statistically speaking, 10% at some point doesn't become valued, then you would trigger it and maybe go to 15 or whatever you needed to be statistically accurate, and that wouldn't be as difficult to swallow. So thank you for your time and your patience.
Thank you, Senator. Anybody else? Peter Burns.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just a question really about the structure of the document. Later on in Section 5, there are some specific recommendations for National Marine Fisheries Service, and one of them is the percentage of reporting, and it says that it will be the percentage that's determined by the board. Now, in this particular section that is specific to the state's reporting, it talks about the states. So we've got an option on the table right now that allows states to be able to optimize how they sample so that they get ensure that they get a representative sample of harvester reporting. Now, would that apply to the National Marine Fisheries Service as well? Is this the point where the board is going to determine how that translates into federal reporting, or is that a separate decision?
I might suggest that it's a little bit separate. There hasn't been that analysis for the federal side on what that optimal reporting percentage is, so I can't give a percentage as to what that is, but I think that would be a discussion under Section 5, if the board is comfortable with that.
You good, Peter? No follow-up?
So you're going to have standards for state reporting and then separate standards for federal reporting? Is that what I'm understanding?
Not necessarily different or separate, but my understanding from a comment before was to take each issue one at a time. So that's where I was going with that. But if you guys want to change it up, that's the board's decision.
David Borden.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Megan, is this recommendation consistent with the guidance we get from the technical committee? Or have they commented on this specific option?
Just to clarify, you mean for state or for federal waters, or on the motion?
For state.
For state. Do you want to do that?
Yes, the technical committee does recommend going to 100%, but then in the interim, the 10% is reasonable.
Dennis Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Langley spoke about Maine's budgetary issues. I think the issues in Maine, I'm sure, are no different than they are in any other state. But from my point of view, I look at Maine's large lobster industry, and I look at how many trap tags they must issue in the millions, 6,000 licenses. It seems like that money should be used for lobster management, or some portion of it, rather than going into the general fund to support things in inland Maine or whatever. So it's hard for me to swallow the fact that we can't do appropriate management measures based on the state of Maine's budget diverting lobster income to other things.
I have Dan McKernan next, but if there's a direct answer to Dennis, I'll take Pat out of order. You're also on the list. Is that Pat Kelleher?
So just to be clear, so I think Senator Langley's reference is to whether we could make up the difference for $500,000. Our license money and our trap tag money go directly to our lobster management fund. They're not diverted to the general fund. In this case, coming up, though, with $500,000 on top of a $270,000 hit that we just took because the price of our trap tags have just recently increased from, I think, 3 to 11 cents. So we're already in a deficit of $270,000, and to add potentially a $500,000 component or bill to to that deficit, we would not be able to cover that cost. We would have to go to the legislature. The legislature would have to then appropriate additional funds to the Department of Marine Resources. And I think to Senator Langley's point, it's not going to happen, especially when fishermen are going to say, wait a minute, it's a 95% confidence interval. Why do we have to do more? It leads us into a political discussion, but I think Senator Langley's reading of the political tea leaves as it comes to the Maine legislature is quite accurate.
Briefly, Dennis, and then Dan's next.
Yeah, thank you, Pat, for that clarification. That's a little different understanding that I had. I was under the impression that your trap tags was gaining a lot more revenue than what I thought. It used to.
It used to until this year.
Thank you.
Dan McKernan.
Thank you, Steve. I plan to oppose the motion, and I just want to give the board a brief thumbnail sketch of the Massachusetts program. We have over 7,400 fishermen who are reporting trip level, all the way from the most small-scale clamor up to an offshore lobster boat. We have 6,200 reports that come into us as trip-level reporters at the state level. Another 1,200 fill out VTR. So in Massachusetts, if you're filling out a VTR, you don't have to fill out a state trip-level report. So we have a program right now that is comparable to what Maine is fearing in terms of the number of participants. And I don't think it costs us $500,000. I have been looking at the Rhode Island model where they put a surcharge on the fisherman if the fisherman chooses to submit paper, which puts burden on the state to key punch those records. And I think, if I'm not wrong, it's a $50 surcharge, and they have a 54% electronic reporting rate, which clearly reduces the burden on the state. And I think that's a great model, and it's something that we want to look at in Massachusetts. And so I'm sympathetic to the plight of the Maine legislature and the agency, but this really needs to be borne by the industry and the industry members to submit these catch reports. And the reason we didn't get a lot of comments south of Maine is at the public hearings is because, by and large, people accept this and they can't believe that we don't have it now. And my last comment is, I won't go into all the gore, but one of the most painful professional experiences for me was the debates over the monument proposals that were occurring last year or a year and a half ago at the end of the Obama administration, when folks were trying to understand the impacts to these fisheries in the southern Georges Bank area, and all we could produce is huge stat area summaries that were not suitable for us to sort of fight back or explain the impacts to these fisheries. And I think we owe it to our successors, those who are going to inherit lobster management 5, 10, and 15 years from now, to really bring this up into modern standards. 10 years ago, we enacted Addendum 10, and the expectation was to eventually go to 100%. Massachusetts went from 10 to 20 to 100 in the span of 3 years because our staff told us, why would we make all this investment with a fisherman in year 1 and not use and have them go away in year 2? I mean, once they've done the electronic reporting or the trip-level reporting, they were in favor of it. So that's why I'm going to vote against the motion.
Doug Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe this is a very important addendum, particularly as we start having to deal with, in our next addendum, potentially some impacts to climate change and trying to build some resiliency into this fishery. I am certainly sympathetic to the budgetary issues that Maine has brought forward with this. The concern I have with the motion on the board is it doesn't start moving towards the 100% reporting that the TC has put forward as a recommendation in the long term. I see the optimization as being a good step forward, but it's optimization with 10%. I also, one of the things that I think is very important as we move on into the future here is to get a better idea of the spatial extent of the fishery. And I am concerned that at 10%, we're not going to get that. You know, the TC recommended back in October that 100% harvester reporting in the lobster and Jonah crab fishery to accurately account for all trap hauls and the spatial extent of the effort. I understand the TC saying that from a catch standpoint, catch estimate standpoint, that 10% is statistically viable, and I believe, I certainly understand the analysis they did, and I think that's a good way to go, but I think at some point we've got to start moving forward, both in state waters and at federal waters, towards 100%. If this had some mechanism to start moving even incrementally forward, I would be willing to support this, but at this point, I can't support this unless there's some movement to something that we put forward over 10 years ago as a need for this fishery.
Pat Kelleher.
Maine has 20,000 license holders. Dan's comment on regarding all of the license holders in Massachusetts equates to 7,500. We deal with 30,000 reports alone with 10% harvester reporting. Then we have all of our other fisheries associated with it. So I just want to make sure it's clear to the board that the Maine's landings program is significant in size and stature, dealing with all of our harvesters and all of our dealers across all of the fisheries. The point around corals and monuments, I agree, Dan. I mean, having those, having better data associated with those is important. Maine was successful pulling together very detailed information from a financial and effort standpoint in regards to the coral conversations of the state of Maine, and we were successful utilizing that information through the New England Council approach to minimize the financial impact to the state of Maine. To Doug's point in regards to this motion, option B, as it's the language within option B, under this option, states maintain 100% harvester reporting unless they have less, and that in the case of Maine is obviously 10%. It goes on to, the language within the document goes on to say it is expected that the states will work towards 100% harvester reporting over time through the use of electronic reporting. That is specified within option B. And I am fully supportive of that. There are some problems associated with E-trips within the state of Maine. There are 6 or 7 data points that we require that E-trips does not capture. If E-trips is the tool that we need to use to go forward, that's fantastic. But my staff continues to show great concerns and tell me about their concerns as it relates to E-trips. I think we need to roll up our sleeves and develop a system across states and with the federal government that's specific to 100% reporting electronically, but is also user-friendly and not not clumsy, as to use a term that my staff uses in regards to E-trips. So. If you want more explicit language within the motion, I'm certainly willing to consider it. But to have the motion reflect anything other than 10% in some incremental fashion moving forward, when the TC has said it is of marginal benefit, I'd rather spend my money on things that are frankly more important at this time while we focus on electronic reporting development.
David Borden, and I haven't seen any others, so we're going to have to move forward after this.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, Terry?
Yes. So I guess following up on Pat's point, how long would it take us to, and Doug's point, how long would it take us to review the electronic reporting issue and basically make the types of changes that Pat is requesting. It seems to me, going back to the point that Doug made and Pat has made, what we need is we need a timeline in this motion that's on the table. Sounds like it would be acceptable if we had a timeline and a path to revise the electronic reporting form. So how long is it going to take us to do that? I don't know the technical nuances of that as well as I should. So can somebody address that, or I don't know whether Jeff is here.
Thank you, Jeff.
No problem. I'm sorry for arriving a little bit late. Can you just catch me up on what changes to the electronic reporting piece you'd be asking for?
Do you want to do it? Pat, you were the one that said it was lacking, I believe. The electronic, can you explain what you'd like?
So, in conversations with my staff, and Jeff, thanks for being here because I think it's important. When I talk about electronic reporting based on the concerns within the state of Maine, I'm not sure that E-Trips is, frankly, the right way to go. It was not developed for this. It could be modified and it could work for this, and I'm certainly open to that conversation. But I think there are other technologies out there that might get us to the same point in a way that is more user-friendly from the industry. I got an email from my staff in regards to this. I asked them to pull together their concerns, and we're getting a lot of feedback here. I'm not sure. Is that a little better? Okay. That's great.
Get your phone out of here.
Get my phone out of here. This is purely intentional on my part. Yeah, I don't think it's my mic.
Pat, if you don't mind, I'll let Terry go, and then when they get your mic straightened out, you can answer that question. Terry, would you like to go? Or?
Sure.
Oh, now you can't. Go ahead, Terry.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here on behalf of the New England Council, and overall the Council appreciates the Commission's work on this addendum and supports measures that will improve monitoring in federal waters. However, the Council does not support the motion on the board. As the lobster and crab fisheries continue to shift operations further offshore, they're going to increasingly interact with other federally managed fisheries, the species targeted in those fisheries, habitats, corals, and protected resources. In addition, there are a number of offshore wind and other energy projects currently being proposed. It's important that we all understand the patterns of effort so we can better estimate the bycatch and consider other overlaps between these fisheries and the other federal fisheries and habitats that the Council manages. I'm hoping that this motion will be amended and the Council can then provide some support.
Thank you, Terry. I'm going to go to Peter Burns. The clerks are still playing with plugs, Pat, and then I'll get back to you.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. You know, this gets back to my earlier question about whether we're going to determine the level of federal reporting within this motion or in this section of the document or later on, and it sounds like they're going to be two separate decisions. And so given that, you know, this does have implications on the federal side, because if the board was to approve this motion here, and then my thinking is that if there's going to be any increased request for increased federal reporting later on, any of the spatial data gaps that result from only a 10% harvester reporting in Maine are going to fall in the lap of federal permit holders and on the federal government to cover that gap. And I thought Doug made a good point, which is, you know, the relevance of the robustness of the the TC's analysis of Maine's sampling program talks about trap halls and landings, but it doesn't really talk about or get to the issue of the spatial representation of harvester reporting coast-wide. We know we have a big black hole in reporting somewhere in the Gulf of Maine and into Georges Bank. So we've got a situation where the federal government wouldn't necessarily fall into this optimal situation where we could try to adjust our reporting requirements to get a better geographical resolution. And if we were required to report at a higher level, we'd have these much higher administrative costs and things like that. We do have, electronic reporting is something that we're working on, and it's come a long way, but it's not completely done yet. And so any kind of immediate reporting requirement would have to, come under the existing budgets and things like that we have, and we don't have the fee structure or the trap tags or any of these other types of revenues that can help offset those costs. We don't charge federal permit holders anything. So my concern is that, although I can appreciate the TC's analysis, and I can certainly appreciate Maine's budgetary situation, I don't think that this gets to the spatial need for data offshore. And I'm just concerned that this would fall into just become the responsibility of the federal government to pick up the slack here. And so I can't support this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Is your mic working yet, Pat?
How's this? Better? Just to an earlier point, from a numbers perspective, Maine does 100,000 harvester reports and nearly 500,000 dealer reports, to give you a size of our current landings program. But to the point in regards to e-trips, these are the concerns expressed from my staff. Program does not have great intuitive flow to the process. Harvesters continue to be very frustrated with the program. It only works on Android platforms unless changes have been made that we're not aware of. It interfaces with SAFIS, not the Maine licensing system database. There are very few checks and balances. Fields have no validation at time of data entry. Areas fish selection needs major revisions, zone and distance from shore using current data elements. Too many pages to scroll through. And with issues around functionality, more customer service needs to be the focus. And just from an element standpoint, Maine regulations require additional information beyond the e-trips, including number of sets, time of sets, total gear in the water, depth, Maine Lobster's license, the Maine home zone information, distance from shore, and then sea time. So there's a lot within e-trips that is not captured for what the state of Maine's needs are. So I think, as we look at this, are we looking, I guess to back up, we had a data reporting workshop where we spent a lot of time focused on electronic reporting. The state of Maine continues to be very supportive of electronic reporting. I think it potentially, if we can fix the electronic reporting in a way that satisfies all jurisdictions, including the comments by Peter Burns today, then we can get to a point where we're dealing with the spatial resolutions within this fishery that people are so concerned about. I think we need to put our efforts in that basket. We need to start really focusing on the development of a good, usable platform from an electronic monitoring standpoint. This 10% allocates or optimized was supported by the TC, but the TC wants more. They want 100%. And to get to that 100% based on option B is to really start focusing on electronic reporting. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll shut up.
Thank you. Jeff, did you get what you needed?
Yes, thank you. So a couple of things. Number one, ACCSP, eTrips, and eTrips Mobile do support third-party apps that submit the data through an API. So it's becoming a lot less of a conversation over eTrips is certainly available, and we support the use of it, but if there's another tool that an agency wants to use that can still submit it via the API, that means it still lands in the SAFIS database every evening, and everybody can use it for accessibility for management. So that's a big plus. I think in the point of 100,000 fishermen reports per year, I believe that is, the technology and the servers that ACCSP have will have no issues handling that data volume. It's, of course, the issues of compliance tracking and the work on the other end. The question was, what's the timeline schedule to address the concerns raised by Maine in terms of area fished, number of sets, time of sets, the sea time, distance from shore. I know that there's been a lot of discussion about making some adjustments to those fields for the South Atlantic, so some of those are already in progress. And it would be hard to say exactly how much time it would take to incorporate your list of requested changes. But a lot of those are in process. I don't know exactly the timeline of what you wanted this motion to apply to in terms of what reporting period, but certainly these are all things that we're working on within this year. The data flow is something that in the overall SAFES redesign is an ongoing process. But some of those points that you brought up, which fields are available, when could they be incorporated, can the servers handle the volume, those are in process and would go through pretty much the normal Information Systems Committee change management process. So.
Thank you. I've got Mark Alexander and then Dennis Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Coming from a fiscally challenged state, I certainly sympathize with Pat Kelleher's point of view. I believe really we should be focusing on electronic reporting. I think once that's established and adopted by all the states, then a lot of the spatial challenges and the percent participation challenges will help solve themselves. I do think that it might be good for the Lobster Technical Committee and the ACCSP Commercial Technical Committee maybe to have a joint meeting. The Lobster TC has a good feeling for what's needed to better manage the fishery, and I think the Commercial Technical Committee will have a better idea about how best to implement that in the ACCSP standards and subsequently in whatever reporting applications come out of that. They may be even able to recommend whether it's worthwhile to actually put a lobster-specific skin on the reporting application to make it easier and more user-friendly for fishermen. But I don't think us forcing Maine into an escalating, percentage of reporting over the next 5 years or whatever some of the other alternatives mentioned is really going to be productive here. I think focusing on electronic reporting, I think will in the end achieve what is set out to do in this addendum. So.
Thank you, Mark. I have Dennis, then Adam Nowalski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My recollection is many years ago when George LaPointe was in Pat's seat that when we instituted 10%, there was an understanding that the percentage was going to increase. But more specifically, my question is, Pat mentioned, and I think I'm quoting him correctly, is that the technical committee stated that it would be of marginal value if we increase from 10%. If that's the case, then why are we going through this exercise? But I would appreciate a comment from the technical committee. Does the technical committee think that increasing from 10% is marginal? Could we have a comment from the technical committee?
So over the range evaluated of sampling up to 40%, I think it was in the report, the increase or the decrease in increase in precision was marginal over those values. So I think that's what the technical committee was referring to as far as a marginal improvement by increasing percentage between 10% and 100%.
Follow up, Dennis?
So it seems persuasive that there's no need to go up from 10%, even though I think it's a good idea.
Adam? And Jim will be next.
So we've heard a number of concerns with this motion, primarily from the state of Maine. We've heard concerns with regards to some other motion from the state of Maine. We've heard concerns from the service about a gap that would occur if we don't get to 100%. We've heard concerns that the TC would like to see an increase in reporting. I've heard a number of people indicate that they would support the increase in electronic reporting. So I'm going to make an effort here to try to move this forward and bridge this gap. And I'm going to move to amend the motion to add 100% harvester reporting will be required through electronic reporting within 5 years. And if there's a second to that,
Do we have a second?
Provide a little more support.
Second from Richie.
So if I could just...
Go ahead.
So I think what this accomplishes is the option C that we have in here sets out specific increases that we need to see as soon as next year. This essentially gives the state of Maine, ACCSP, and any other management bodies, reporting bodies that need to be involved, gives us 5 years to work them out, but gives us all, as we leave here today, a finite deadline to work towards, and that would be my reason for making this motion. Thank you.
I have one question, and that is if as fast as electronic and computer stuff moves, it probably will be, but if it is not ready satisfactorily in 5 years, and this passes, where are we left?
I would see this management body having to have to take some subsequent action at that time.
Adam, would you look at what's up there and make sure that was what you said?
Yes, that is correct.
Discussion. David Warden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the concept of what Adam has put forth, but I'd go back to the point that Mark made, which I thought was a good point, that if we get 2 of our committees together, they basically can look at this issue, examine all the points that Pat has raised, the concerns that the Maine staff have raised, and then come back to us and actually give us a timeline of what is reasonable, a reasonable expectation in terms of trying to revise the existing system. I mean, the way I understood Pat is he's willing to go to 100% electronic reporting, but the system has to change, and what we lack here is some calendar that's based on estimates by the technical people that know the issue the best to come back to us with a deadline. It's almost like we should approve some kind of motion here with a timeline, but then refer it to the technical people and ask them to report at the next meeting as to how long it's going to take us to transition to the new system, and then set the deadline. I don't think anybody here at the table would support 5 years if it's going to take 10 years. to get there. But on the other hand, if it's going to take 2 years to get there, I think a lot of the people around the table would want 2 years in this motion. So we won't know that until they have that technical discussion. So in my case, I could vote for this, but I'd probably want to table the entire motion until the next meeting and get the type of input that Mark described. Thank you.
Next on my list is Jim Gilmore, but Jim, you wanted to speak to the main motion. Do you want to speak to the amendment, or shall I go on to amendment, people?
I'll try to speak to both. I'm trying to help you, Pat, here. I'll pass because I'm not going to be able to do this. My microphone doesn't work either.
I have Richie White and then Doug.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I seconded this motion for two reasons. One is I think the 5 years is reasonable, and speaking to David's concerns, if this doesn't happen, as Adam said, we're going to have to take another action. So at least this puts something in place that pushes us ahead on electronic reporting, number one. Number two, it gives the state of Maine time to address this financially. So you have plenty of time to talk to the legislature, explain to them the importance of this, the data that we're desperately going to need that now is not coming in. And I think that clearly has shown the need for additional information with the questions that are being raised about the fishery moving offshore into federal and deeper waters and the issues with recruitment. So Maine is clearly going to need more information to understand what's happening with this resource. So I think 5 years is fine. We can always take action in the future if we have to adjust that, and I support the motion.
Doug Rout.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just support this amendment because it does get at one of my major concerns. One thing that I am a little bit concerned about is that, as brought up by David Borden, is he suggested maybe we should get the Lobster Technical Committee and the commercial ACCSP Commercial Technical Committee together to try and figure out what the time frame, what appropriate time frame would be, to try and avoid us having to go through an entire addendum again. If this passes, I might offer up some modified language to this that would allow the board to adjust the time frame by a board vote instead of having to go through another addendum to adjust that time frame. And if the maker and the second, I can either make a motion to amend the motion, which may be the amendment, which may be kind of cumbersome. I might offer up a suggestion that to the maker and seconder, if they'd be willing to accept it, that the time frame may be changed via or modified. The time frame may be modified by board vote.
Modified would allow it to go either way.
Yes.
Would the maker of the motion be satisfied with that?
So I appreciate the intent here, but I'm not going to view it as friendly for two reasons. The first reason is I specifically chose the use of the word within for the purpose of, if we get input that we can achieve this in 3 years, we should do it. The second reason is that 5 years, one of the concerns I'm hearing is the time to develop this electronically. 5 years in the world of software is an eternity. I would sincerely hope that we would be able to have the resources to move this forward within that timeline, and I can't see going beyond that. I think that gets away from anything in this document. Nothing in this document contemplated a timeline beyond that. So I appreciate the intent, but I wouldn't support it as a friendly amendment.
So Doug, you're left with either making it an amendment to the amendment or letting it go.
If, I'm going to withdraw this concept at this point. I'll just leave it at that. I think Adam made some good points.
Can I just clarify one thing here?
Go ahead.
So I just want to clarify one thing to make sure everyone's on the same page. When I read this motion, I just want to make sure that everyone knows that this doesn't say Maine anywhere in it. So the 100% reporting through electronic reporting, to me, is applying to every state in this motion. So I just want to make sure every state is comfortable with that, unless I'm reading this wrong. Right. So within 5 years, every state has to be doing 100% electronic reporting. If you are uncomfortable with this, now would be the time to speak up.
Dan?
Yes, obviously, if we want to accommodate some percentage of harvesters who prefer paper, I think we should have that opportunity to do that. So I think the motion is flawed.
Anybody else? Oh, Dave.
This is one of those moments, Mr. Chairman, where I think we need a little bit of time to work on the language here rather than try to forge our way through this. So I'm going to make a motion to table this, and the intent is to deal with some of these other issues, and then we'll come back to it after a break. And I would hope that some of the suggestions around the table have been written down so that we can revise this at that time. So I'm going to make a motion to table.
Go ahead, Bob.
Mr. Borden, are you just tabling the motion to amend? Or are you trying to sort of set both of these motions aside for a while and to a time specific within this meeting?
My intent is to set them aside for a while and allow us to deal with some of the other issues and hopefully recraft this rather than try to do it the way we're doing it right now.
Craft it today?
And that would take place at this meeting, in other words, before we break, to reconsider it.
So it's clearly a motion to table. We'll pick it back up later at the same meeting. Is anybody else second? Is there a second? Yes, Senator Langley. Okay, we have a motion on the floor to table this to later in the meeting. Is there any opposition to that? All right, we'll move on to our next item.
There's still 2 more issues in the document regarding the data elements and then the spatial resolution, the spatial resolution of the data.
Doug Grout?
Yeah, I would move under issue 2, harvest reporting data components, that we select option C, expanded data elements regarding gear configuration, in parentheses, number of traps per trawl, number of buoy lines, and I forgot what the third one was. Okay.
Do we have a second? David Borden. Discussion. Pat Kelleher.
I think this is a question for Noah, Mr. Chairman. Is it likely that protected resources is going to require an annual recall survey of gear. Do you know if that's in the cards? Is that going forward, or is that outside of your...
Peter?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the question, Pat. I think I'm probably speaking out of school a little bit. I think that the intent of the agency is to improve its reporting with respect to getting better information to help the situation with the large whales and things like that. I don't know specifically if there's a movement underway to do that, but I think some of that might be contingent upon what happens here today and what happens with this addendum. And if we can get that kind of information through an expanded reporting requirement this way, then that might alleviate some of the burden on the government to try to get that information some other way. And I think what you're hinting at is this going to be redundant information? And I think if there's something that comes from this board today that requires expanded reporting, we could work internally to try to make sure that fishermen are trying to provide that information in as efficient way as possible.
Any other questions about the motion? Comments? Okay. We don't need a roll call to the final, right? Okay. Oh, Peter.
Thank you. I'm sorry to stop the progress here, but I just wanted to clarify that this pertains to to the states as well, right? It's not state and federal reporting.
We always include in the addendums that the recommendation for federal waters to enact regulations that complementary or mirror the regulations in state waters. So I assume that's how we would deal with these two data elements for federal waters.
Dan McKiernan.
But to Peter's question, you wouldn't want a redundant report, and so if the states are collecting that information, which we do now, in an annual recall, there wouldn't be a requirement for the fishermen to fill out a complementary federal report.
Correct. I think my question, or Peter let me know if it's, I think the question was towards the VTR, if that needs to be added to VTR, not necessarily an annual recall, but maybe Peter can clarify that.
Go ahead, Peter Burns.
Thank you. Yeah, and that sort of did get to my question, because I think that, if we're not, we can do some expanded data elements as we move forward with electronic reporting, but to try to fold those now into something in our existing paper forms, as I mentioned earlier, we've got to go through a whole process to change these forms and to get get that all squared away. So any kind of expansion in the data elements likely would come through an expanded reporting, electronic reporting requirement moving forward.
Before I ask any more questions, we're on a second item in this topic, and we keep running into a similar situation where we don't have the ability to collect what we need to report, yet we're trying to drive this car down the road. It seems like we've missed something here, in my opinion, and I don't know whether it's we haven't got the horse in front of the cart yet or not. Am I missing out on, am I missing the point here that everything we've tried to do, we're missing the fact that we can't collect the data, or we can't report the data, or we're not ready to assimilate the data? Have we gotten out ahead of ourselves? Anybody? Doug.
With this particular motion, I don't see it's really getting out ahead of it. Many of the states already collect this information. We were able to add this into the ACCSP database. I mean, we had no problem doing that. So I don't see that this is going to be a major lift for, it should be a major lift for anybody on this. I mean, we did it very simply.
Okay, then any other discussion on this motion? Seeing none. We don't need a roll call. Can I do this by consensus?
Yeah.
Is there any opposition to the motion? No opposition. The motion is approved. Borden.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On issue 3, I'll make a motion to approve option D, 10-minute squares, plus LCMA.
Is there a second? Doug Grau. Discussion. David, would you like to explain your motion?
Yeah, and I just go back and make this quick. I go back to the point that Dan and others around the table have made. We've gone through a whole series of issues here. The Coral Amendment, particularly as it pertained to the areas off of Maine, wind towers, where we needed better spatial and temporal resolution of the data. We've looked at the guy on my immediate right and I have agonized over the issue of the monument impacts with others. We need better resolution in terms of the data that we're collecting. And I know that there's been some resistance from some parties on this, but we need the data in order to defend the lobster industry from some of these types of activities. So I think 10-minute squares is reasonable. The council looked at this. I don't know whether Terry wants to comment on it, but 10-minute squares are a reasonable type of intensity so that we can draw valid conclusions from it. So I think that's kind of as good as we can get it.
Doug, you seconded. Would you like to speak?
Nothing more than what David indicated.
Terry Stockwell.
Yeah, to follow up on Dave and Doug, the council did support option D as the most comprehensive way to gather the information possible that we need to better manage all the issues on our plate in front of us.
Thank you, Terry. Mark Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just want to make 2 points. The first is that I think 10-minute squares would dramatically help the collection of data in the offshore fishery. I'm not sure, especially in the case of Long Island Sound, that 10-minute squares would be particularly informative. If you look at the map in Appendix 4, it just doesn't gain you much beyond the statistical sub-areas that we presently use. I don't know how other states feel about state waters or nearshore waters, whether the 10-minute squares are helpful or appropriate. I wouldn't mind hearing from other people if they think otherwise, but that's where I'm thinking. And the second is, a point was raised at our public hearings that fishermen wouldn't mind reporting by 10-minute squares as long as they don't have to fill out a separate report for each 10-minute square. And I think one of them even suggested he envisioned, if you're using electronic reporting in a mobile application, that you just be able to highlight the particular 10-minute squares that you're fishing in on that trip on a map on the screen instead of having to, enter a square number or anything like that. And I think that's a good idea. That might cause a little bit of complication, the person reporting more than one 10-minute square, but it's certainly a lot finer resolution than broad statistical areas. So I would like that to at least be taken into consideration, especially if we're going to convene the TC and the Commercial Technical Committee together to talk about this. I'd like that to be an option on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm wondering, currently the eTrips app, does that allow for 10-minute square reporting? Can it accommodate that? That's part one of the question. And the other part is whether or not it can or cannot accommodate 10-minute square reporting. If a fisherman indicates lat long, down to at least minutes, if not minutes and seconds for that long, can the program just interpolate that and put it in a 10-minute square?
I don't know if Jeff can answer that or not, but I'm assuming within the timeline we're setting up, it could be accommodated. If that first issue comes back around, maybe you can answer now. 10-minute squares?
There's technology for part of the application already works where you can look at a grid and actually put your finger on it on the tablet, which grabs a lat long that can fit in with the 10-minute grid squares. So, or the distance from shore issues. So the 10-minute grid squares, as long as the codes are developed, it's actually not that difficult to get the program to make it work.
Thank you, Jeff. Dan? Kernan?
I'd like to follow up on a point that Mark Alexander made, that within the state fisheries, some of us have statistical reporting areas that are already smaller than 10-minute squares, and I'd like to be able to retain those for historical purposes, even though they don't line up exactly with 10 minutes, but they're clearly more refined. So I don't know if I need an amendment or just on the record that states with their own statistical reporting areas within their state can retain those.
Pat, do you have an answer to that or another question?
I've got an answer for everything, Mr. Chairman. No, I agree with Dan. I think, in that case, you're just being more conservative, and I think the states need to be able to retain that type of reporting for their own uses and needs. So it may be a very good question to roll in with any development. If we're going to have a subcommittee looking at electronic reporting, that question should just be rolled into it. I personally don't see it needing to be made part of the motion.
My only question for both of you before we kind of move past that is, do these sub-areas sometimes overlay 2 squares? Pat?
Not in the state of Maine's case. I mean, we're reporting 0 to 3, 3 to 12, and then 12 and beyond. But, if it does, I think thinking out loud, if there is the tablet approach that Jeff just spoke of, and you're just tapping on that line, that may actually, and the lat long pots up, then that may actually get it to what Dan is talking about through the development of the electronic application.
Thank you, Pat. Jeff White, you've got your hand up.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify, the ACCSP standard has 3 levels of area codes. There's the grand statistical area. Below that is a sub-area which the 10-minute grid cells can be mapped to. And then below that, there's a local area. The local areas have been used currently for shellfish areas, but those local areas would be where the areas smaller than a 10-minute grid cell could be defined by the state and therefore entered by the fishermen. So the fields exist. The codes might need some development or completion so they're consistent up and down the coast, but the capability is already there.
Thank you, Mark. I see you. David, you made the motion. I have a question. Would you consider the subgroups that are smaller than the 10-minute squares but may overlap one in a violation of the rule we're putting in place in this motion, or is it small enough and good?
Mr. Chairman, no, I think it's actually consistent. The Lobster plan has a provision that allows states to be more restrictive, and so I think this is consistent with it. And I would say it's consistent with my intent, if Doug agrees with that.
Doug Rowe.
Thank you. I do. I totally agree with that. In fact, I can see several instances where a fisherman may be fishing in multiple 10-minute squares on a single day, and so they'd be filling out multiple squares, and they would also be filling out the local state codes in the same manner.
Thank you, Doug. Yes, Mark.
Yes, in the case of Long Island Sound, the sub-areas that Jeff referred to do not align with 10-minute squares. The lines are, I would say, as a rule, are not drawn exactly horizontal or vertical. They're at the orientation of Long Island Sound. They help define the boundary line between Connecticut and New York state waters. And unfortunately, we don't have a graph of sufficient resolution to actually see where those 10-minute squares lie with in relation to the sub areas. But my guess is that each sub area probably contains more than one 10-minute square, and each 10-minute square may contain more than one sub area. So.
Any other questions? Before I actually ask for a vote on this, I'm very uncomfortable with part of this because we are basically saying we know we said 10-minute squares, but we don't care if you're in more than one as long as it's a subgroup. And I don't know if having that in the minutes is satisfactory to not have a fisherman who has to fill out a logbook be in violation because he didn't write 3 of the 10-minute squares down. So do we need to amend this, or is having this in the minutes enough that the intent of the motion is that the subgroup satisfies the intent? Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's probably better to create an exemption for states within their state waters to maintain their existing statistical reporting areas. That would make sense to me, just for clarity.
David, you'd be willing to amend your motion, correct whatever you need to do to that motion to make that work so we don't have to wonder?
That's acceptable to me if it's acceptable to Doug.
Dan, do you have language for them that they could use to amend their own motion or correct their own motion?
I'd make a motion to amend to allow states to retain their within state statistical reporting areas.
That was deemed friendly by both the maker and the seconder, so it's automatically added, as I understand. Is that correct? Okay. Any other discussion?
Dan, could we just maybe clarify that the state statistical reporting areas are finer scale than what's required in the plan?
Thanks, Megan. Actually, I have one statistical reporting area that's bigger than a 10-minute square in southeastern Cape Cod Bay, so I can't say, with any integrity that all of our statistical reporting areas are smaller than a 10-minute square. But they're all within state waters, and they're historic, and we've worked out the long-term historical record with all of our gear types, and I don't think the technical committee, when they were trying to wrestle with data, really had any issue with what was going on within the state waters. The biggest gap is in the federal zone.
Pat Kelleher.
Just a quick question for Dan. Dan, are your statistical areas, are they similar to what we would refer to as our zones within the state? I mean, you're just using them for management areas?
No, Pat. Our statistical areas go back about 50 years, and many of them do line up with the federal statistical areas, but within the well, historically, we've always had statistical reporting areas for the federal zone. In other words, we have one area that is 521 or 537. But within Massachusetts, we have like Buzzards Bay as its own statistical reporting area. Vineyard Sound is another, and Nantucket Sound is a third. So it really, similar to what Mark was describing, in a lot of cases, these used points of land and just historical fishing behaviors to capture these areas.
Adam Nowalski.
So just as a matter of clarification, the motion as it's up there on the board continues to call this issue 3 option D. I don't think this is option D anymore. Option D specified 10-minute squares and the ability to provide more fine scale data. Where we're at now is we have 10-minute squares, LCMAs, which were actually part of option B, and the ability to maintain state statistical reporting, which we've now heard on the record may not be more fine scale. So I don't know what the best way to handle that is, but I don't think that it's a hybrid of a number of things, but I'm not sure it's option D anymore.
Adam, if I can try to answer this, as I understand it, when we go out to public hearing, when we come back, we don't need to we can actually cherry pick anything within the range of anything we went to public hearing on. So you are probably right that it's not option D, but everything up there was gone out to public hearing individually. So if we remove option D and left the rest, or use the text from option D, everything up there is still in the range of what went out to public hearing.
And I'm not objecting to any of the elements that we've put in here. In fact, I was reinforcing that fact. I'm just saying I don't think we're voting on option D anymore, and it would probably be good to remove that from this motion specifically.
Let me ask staff, if we remove option D and just leave what's up there, is it too vague or does it give us the same thing?
I think it's fine since it spells out 10-minute squares, LCMAs, and allowing, I think all the elements are in there. So just taking out the option D and the 2 commas around it, you're all set.
Of course, that does change the option. I mean, that does change the motion. Richie?
You could just add as modified, issue 3, option D as modified.
Dave Borden.
This is why you never want to watch government in action. Let me just make the point that Adam's point is correct. I would have no objections to taking out the word option D, because I think the rest is consistent with the intent. I'd also make the point that we're getting into some of the fine details here, and I think where we're going to end up at the end of this meeting is we're going to have an approved addendum, but some of the details are going to have to be worked out between the technical committee and the ACCSP staff, and I think we're going to benefit from that type of dialogue going forward, and we may have to consider some minute changes at some point here at the spring meeting. So on the suggestion, if it's all right with Doug route, I would say remove option D, and then maybe we can move on with a vote.
Doug? We have an okay from Doug. Peter Burns.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. At the risk of hopefully not going further into the weeds, I just had a question for David Borden as sort of our in-house expert on the offshore fishery. I know you've recommended this, David, the 10-minute squares, and I just wanted to get an idea, just so that I can get a better understanding of how the burden on us on the federal side of getting more vessel trip reports potentially, and what the burden on the industry would be if somebody in the offshore fishery had to fill out a vessel trip report that had this information in it. Can you give us just a general idea of what the change would be?
David?
Well, I mean, the change, at least my view of this, is what we have to do is we have to move in the direction that Pat Kelleher is trying to push us, which is electronic reporting. And if we do that, then reporting in multiple 10-minute squares will be easier, because you'll be able to do that with simply the way it's been characterized here, just, touching a box. So The offshore boats, just so everyone's clear, the offshore boats will fish in multiple 10-minute squares on every trip. So it's that issue and how you solve that, short of having them fill out a separate page of a VTR, which no one does. I would point out that there are trawlers during the whole coral discussion that would move 150 miles on a trip fishing in different areas, and you know, they're not complying with the requirement to fill out a different page of a VTR. So we need to solve that problem, and the way to solve the problem is to do electronic reporting and make it easy.
Thank you, David. Satisfied, Peter? Okay, any other questions, or shall we call this vote? No other questions. Is there anybody opposed to the motion on the table? Do you need time to caucus or anything? I see no opposition. Motion passes by consensus. We're back to issue 1. David Borden.
Yeah, I'd like to first deal with the pilot program. I kept that out of the motion intentionally. I'd like to make a motion for the Commission to move forward with the development of a pilot electronic tracking program to be implemented in the next year.
Is there a second for that? Pat Kelleher. David?
Yeah, I mean, the logic for doing this, I don't think we're ready to require electronic reporting at this stage, but I think given the experience of the Law Enforcement Committee, and Pat and I have gone before the Law Enforcement Committee on a number of occasions and talked about the need for better federal enforcement, and that whole dialogue has come up in about 4 different venues here recently as a whale meeting that a number of us attended. We need finer scale information. We need to know where some of these boats are fishing, and one of the options is to do that with the electronic system that the Enforcement Committee has been doing some tests of, and that system is very similar to the Urchin system that the state of Maine has been utilizing, and it's also very similar to the enforcement, the system that's been deployed on the enforcement boats in the state of Maine. So I think what we need is a committee to look at this issue, look at the utility of it, deploy some of the units on more of a coast-wide basis, and then once we get all of that, then we can have a policy decision about the pros and cons that are associated with it, but we'll have a much broader scale program to look at the results, and then we can make a determination whether or not we want to deploy it, whether or not we want to deploy it on a certain segment of the fleet or in certain areas. So this, I think, is really an informational gathering activity. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Pat?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with everything David just spoke of. With the experience that we've gained within the state of Maine regarding our Urchin program, the utilization of geofencing within these tracking programs, the experience we have with covert trackers, obviously much different than here, but it directly links to the ability to enforce our laws in both state and federal waters. I think we need to go down this information finding road, and I think, and this came up in in the subcommittee that was established that looked into electronic reporting, the issue of tracking came up, and the ability to link both of those together needs to be part of this conversation as we move forward, because it can be potentially one tool. And I think, while Maine fishermen spoke out against the concept of tracking, other Maine fishermen who are very interested in establishing an offshore zone within Area 1 know that in order to be able to even think about implementing something like that, trackers would have to be a part of that conversation. So I think doing that here through this process is warranted. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Any other? Yes, David.
I just want to quickly add that to what Pat just said, that the implications of this pilot will go far beyond lobster management. In other words, the commission is, if you look at the rest of the agenda we're going to deal with here, they're going to be talking about climate change initiatives, how we make the fleet more cost-effective, how we reduce carbon impacts on the environment, and those types of things. One of the options that's listed in one of the documents we're going to consider over the next couple of days is talking about aggregate limits. And one of the biggest problems with aggregate limits is how do you enforce them? Well, this is a technology that we can bring to bear on those types of issues. So we need more information. This is the way to get it. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Anybody else? You see any hands up? Does anybody oppose this motion? Does anyone need to caucus? No opposition? Passes by consensus. We're back to issue number 1. Dennis, thank you.
Well, I just make a move to remove the issues from the table.
Second. Who seconded? Senator Langley. Okay. So we've got a motion on the table to remove the tabled issues and bring them back to discussion. Do we need to vote on that? Yes. Is there any opposition to doing that? I bet there is. They're just not going to say it. No opposition. All right, we're back to issue number 1. Adam Nowalski.
So just to take a moment to respond to a couple of the concerns I heard that resulted in this being tabled. First off, let me offer that I believe that the combination of the amendment and the original motion would still include the distribution of reporting in an optimal manner as described under option B in the document. So nothing with that amendment, in my opinion, would change that. Secondly, with regards to the requirement of electronic reporting and accommodating those with paper reporting, in the Mid-Atlantic, the for-hire sector, effective next month, recreationally, will no longer be able to report via paper. You will be required to effectively, March 12th, report electronically and electronically only. It's clearly a direction we're moving towards. There's a number of accommodations that have been made, training, electronic devices being given out in some cases to go ahead and accommodate that. So I think that's a direction we're moving towards, and in another 5 years, I think the concept of paper and any reporting will be nearing an archaic level. And finally, with regards to concerns about states having to implement something electronic themselves, it's my belief, and our representatives from ACCSP can certainly provide input, that E-Trips or SAFES could be the collection point for this electronic information, and if the state needs that data, work would be done over the course of the next 5 years to build interfaces to get that data to the states. and that would be the mechanism. I believe some of that data is already with VTR data is going back to the service already directly, so I would be confident that if we knew ahead of time this is a spec for the electronic reporting project, that could be accommodated through technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Who?
Mike Cahill.
Mike Cahill.
Good morning. I could certainly comment to that point. The Safest E-Trips mobile tool is indeed going to be deployed on March 12th to do the reporting requirements. We are already feeding data directly to the servers at GARFO along with the Safest system, and those data are made immediately available to the state agencies that need it. We're also working now with a couple of other third-party vendors to have their systems feed. There's no reason at all that the Safest E-Trips tool could not be modified to transmit the data to whichever, how many more than one server if needed. So it could potentially go directly to Safest and potentially go directly to some state system if that's a requirement for any individual state.
Anybody else? Dan McCarran.
Just to answer a question we asked about 15 minutes ago, is this suggesting that states won't allow fishermen to report on paper in 5 years?
I think it needs to be clarified by the board. I would say that this motion is unclear as to what this is saying. Just reading it, I'm seeing electronic reporting, but I'm not seeing the word paper anywhere in there. So if you want to add it, it might be a good idea.
Dan, do you want to add it?
Yes. Motion to amend to allow a paper reporting option for participating states and NIMS. Because the VTR currently is paper, and if we're still allowing paper for some subset of the fleet, so be it.
Is there a second? Pat Kelleher. Do you feel you need to explain that more, Dan? Pat, do you have anything to say to that one?
Yeah, I mean, at dinner last night, our waiter didn't know where the state of Maine was, and I think he thought we were part of Canada. So, and others at the table don't know where we are either, I guess. So my point is that I think we have some challenges with the 100% electronic reporting. I have to support this because we've got some individuals who, from a connectivity standpoint, would have difficulties. So while the intent is to drive to 100% electronic reporting, there are going to be instances where that probably won't be possible.
By waiver, it should be by waiver.
Yeah, and the senator just made a really good point by waiver to ensure that we don't have just a large group that'll say, well, I'm not going to do that electronically, but force them into potentially a waiver position. But I don't think that needs to be caught up in this motion.
Peter Burns, you had your hands up.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just a question. All the other options for this issue specifically say trip-level reporting, and option B doesn't, and I'm just making sure that this is speaking directly to its requirement for trip-level reporting. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Doug Rowe.
A couple of things. One, I might offer a more simplistic way to say this, and that is to move to 100% harvester reporting to be required through electronic or paper reporting within 5 years. Just might be simpler. The other thing I'll let you know is if we approve this amendment, I'd like to offer another amendment to bring up that option that if less than 100, if a vessel lands less than 100 pounds in the previous year, they would be exempted and be required to do monthly reporting. I'll bring in that wording after we do this, because I don't want to get into an amendment of an amendment of amendment.
Thank you, Doug. Now, I have a concern on your last statement that it doesn't follow the intent of the motion or the second that basically says this won't go forward until the electronic reporting is up to speed or acceptable to all sides, which the way your statement there reads, in 5 years, if we're not doing electronic, we're going to probably have to do paper. Do I read that wrong?
The motion to amend says allow paper reporting option for participating states and NIMS. And what I was just trying to get at with we can leave it at that, but I was just offering to the maker of the motion and the seconder that a simpler way would be to motion to amend that would say 100% harvester reporting be required through electronic or paper reporting. It's just adding 2 words as opposed to and I see at least the maker and or you're the, I've got to figure out who's Dan and Pat. We can leave it the other way, but it just seemed like it was simpler just to say and paper in the original motion, making them, no?
I have Sarah Peak, I had Adam's hand up, and I have Mark again.
Thank you. Mine's a quick question on the last line there. The way I read it, 100% harvester reporting to be required through electronic and paper reporting. That says to me you have to submit it electronically and with paper. I don't think that's the intent of the maker of the motion.
Or.
What do I have next? Adam, I had you next. You're all set? Okay, Mark?
I totally support this. No matter how much you try, there's always going to be some people that will not be able to report electronically. And I think, once you establish electronic reporting, it's in the interest of the state to fold in as many people as they possibly can. There's just a built-in incentive there. And the second thing is, I just want to clarify that all we're talking about here is commercial reporting, not recreational or personal use lobster activity, correct?
I believe currently this is for the commercial section of the plan. We do have reporting in the recreational sector, some and some not. Depends on where it's sent or who's collecting it. Pat Kelleher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can support Doug's language as long as it's clear that the intent, I give up, is as long as it's clear that the intent is that we're going to, to drive as many as possible to 100% reporting, and that there is an option available for people who don't have that ability, not to give them an option to say, let's just keep status quo on the table. So.
So I'm sorry, the discussion we were just having is the position that Doug brought forward should be considered a friendly amendment to Dan's amendment to clarify it that it allows a paper option, essentially. Is there a language that makes that clearer so we can vote?
So I think we're basically just adding the or paper quote into the amended motion. And if everyone's okay with that, we'll take it as a friendly, and then we can vote on the amended motion.
So the maker and the seconder are happy with that as a friendly. Okay, so that is in there. Are we ready to vote for the amendment on the, I'm sorry, not for, on the amendment? I see no opposition to voting on the amendment. All those in favor, well, I'll do it by consensus. Is anyone opposed to the amendment? I see no hands up. Okay, so now the main motion as amended, let's get that up there. Dave, we know what it's going to say. Do you have a comment?
I'm going to make a suggestion, and the suggestion is we take a 5-minute break and try to rewrite this motion. And all the elements are up there. We just need to rewrite the motion and not deal. I don't want to see the new chair get off on the wrong foot of motion.
I'm with you. We'll take a 5-minute break and wait for this to get up there. If you don't mind taking your seats, we're going to get started again. If everybody's ready to start, we have the amended motion at the bottom of the screen. I don't want to rush anyone here, give everyone a chance to read it. Is there any, Mark, go ahead.
Just for clarification, Mr. Chair, so this amended motion is going to be an amendment to the main motion or a replacement for it?
So we'll first vote on that bottom part, the amended motion, and then we'll put those two sections together in a single motion, and that will become the main motion.
So this is a motion to amend, not really an amended motion then, right?
You're right.
Well, it's already been amended, that's what he was saying.
Oh, okay. Is there any opposition to the, to word it properly, motion to amend? Okay, so that passes by consensus. Now to deal with the motion as amended. Now becomes the main motion. They're going to pull that up. Doug, what do you have?
I have another motion to amend, and they're putting it together, but I will read it at this point. And the motion to amend is if a commercial harvester landed less than 1,000 pounds of lobster and Jonah crab in the previous year, that individual can submit a monthly summary of landings data rather than the trip level reports. And if I get a second, I'll speak to it.
Is there a second?
No.
Any second? Emerson.
So this was a concept that was in option C, sub-option 2 in the amendment. And the reason I put this in there is because it would help alleviate some of the reporting burden on a lot of very small harvesters, the state reporting burden. We have implemented this in our state for a number of years. These individuals that land less than 1,000 pounds per year amount to about 5% of our total harvest. The trip level guys are reporting on 95% of our harvest. Yet these people make up more than 50% of our lobstermen in our state. And so what I think this could provide a state with a little bit more cost-effective way of getting at the majority of the landings information that we use, and it would still provide very high-level, trip-level reporting for the full-time harvesters.
Emerson, do you have any comments on this as a seconder? Okay.
No, Mr. Chairman.
Adam Nowalski.
To clarify what the landings summary or summary of landings data would entail, we had made motions about expanded data elements earlier for trips patrol and number of buoy lines. We also made a motion on spatial resolution. Would those elements be excluded from these monthly summary of landings, or is the goal to somehow incorporate that enhanced collection of data in that monthly summary?
I would like to see if we could incorporate some of that information, but on a monthly summary level.
You satisfied that that's in there, Adam?
I just think it's important to the record and for the fishermen that are going to be impacted by this, what the expectation's going to be that they'll be reporting on a monthly basis.
Dan McKiernan.
My question has to do with the federal aspect of this. I think the intent is among folks like Doug and others who have small-scale fishermen near shore who are not fishing in the EEZ to be eligible for this lower level of reporting. But I wonder if we should make it specific to state waters. I don't know if there's any, if this would undermine any federal reporting standards.
I would have no problem with doing that. I'll have to admit I would assume that there would be very few, if any, that with the federal permits that are using traps out in federal waters that would be landing less than 1,000 pounds. That would not be a very economically viable business out in federal waters.
Eric Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is it 1,000 pounds of lobsters and 1,000 pounds of Jonah crabs, or is it combined weight?
I would say either or. Should I say, it's what I had in here, I pulled this out of the addendum, and the way I took it was 1,000 pounds of lobsters and 1,000 pounds of Jonah, but it says and Jonah crab. So I guess the way it's written, it's a combination, correct?
That's my interpretation, but I took this from the New Hampshire regs, so that's what it says in there.
And in our case, that's lobster, at least within state waters. So let's leave it as is, 1,000 pounds of combination, just to make it simple.
Peter Burns.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I think Dan's comment was a good one. I think that if this pertains to state waters, I think it makes it a lot cleaner to be able to move forward with something like this. But if this starts to spread out into federal waters for a federal permit holder who fell under these criteria, I'm not sure we could support that on the federal side with respect to how we require reporting with a vessel trip report.
Doug, would you like to specify that to state waters or not?
Sure. If the chair would allow me, I would just say if a state waters commercial harvester.
Is the seconder okay with the change?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, the maker and seconder have amended their own amendment. Anybody else? Okay. Is there anybody opposed to Mr. Grout's amendment? Do you see anybody? Okay, we'll call that passed with consensus. Now, the main motion as amended. Discussion. David Borden.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not a motion to amend. I just want to make sure that the intent here is to allow, as I think Mark Alexander recommended some time ago, for the ACCSP staff to meet with the technical staff and work through these the main concerns, and then come back to us with a report on this. So this is all subject to that type of qualifier. Is that correct? That's what the intent is.
Does everybody understand that to be the intent? Is there anyone that felt it wasn't? Speak now. Okay, that's clear and on the record.
Can I request that report be submitted by the spring meeting then? Thank you.
It's been requested.
We'll work toward that, I guess, is the best answer, David. You know, if it turns into something more cumbersome and some of the elements of the electronic reporting, you know, timeline take more time than anticipated, we will give you an update at a minimum at the May meeting and see if we can bring the whole report to you.
If there are no other questions, we have to vote on the main motion, and I understand it needs to be read. I have to turn around to read it. Move to approve Issue 1, Option B, maintain current harvester reporting effort and allocate reporting through an optimal approach. 100% harvester reporting to be required through electronic or paper reporting within 5 years. If a state waters commercial harvester landed less than 1,000 pounds of lobster and Jonah crab in the previous year, that individual can submit a monthly summary of landings rather than trip-level reports. Adam Nowalski, you have a question.
I just had a minor grammatical correction. The 100% harvester reporting to be required either should become will be required, or the period prior to 100% should become a comma and insert the word with. But right now, as that stands, that second item isn't a sentence, I don't believe.
Is everyone satisfied that that was a grammatical correction and not substantive to the motion?
The intent of the original motion was for that to be added with a comma with, but as it was put together, I think will makes it work here, and I'll defer to the chair for how to address it.
My take would be it's a grammatical correction to the wording that was posted and need to be done, but you think it's good the way it is?
No, my only question was who made this motion and who seconded it?
The very first motion was made by Pat Keller, seconded by Jim Gilmore.
I've been doing this by consensus, but this has been the one that's taken the most time, so I think we're going to have a vote on this one. I'll let everyone caucus, and we're going to vote. All in favor of the motion behind me, please raise your right hand. All opposed? I could have stuck with consensus. Abstentions? No votes? Thank you very much. Motion passes. Dan, go ahead.
I wanted that to pass, so I didn't want to raise any issues to postpone that. However, I just want to point out that in NIMS's letter to the board, they talk about they have 50% reporting now, but I don't believe that 50% is through an optimal approach. In fact, I don't think there's any statistical design to that 50. It just happens to be that because of the requirements of other management plans, namely groundfish, scallops, et cetera, any of those permit holders has to report on VTRs. But I still believe that there is a bias about the representation within the population of VTR reporters to the south, or to those harvesters who have that permit type. So I don't know what recommendation we're going to make to NIMS, but I don't think they're going to do anything in terms of an optimal approach. And so I would urge NIMS to go to 100% reporting as soon as practical, because of all the other pressures that the board and the industry is under, and 100% reporting by NIMS as soon as possible will solve, I think, a lot of problems in terms of the management challenges we're going to have.
I think you wanted that more on the record than actually a statement from me. Okay, thank you. So now we have, I believe, a roll call vote for this amendment and addendum on all of these assimilated. I have somebody's hand up. David Borden.
Mr. Chairman, do we still have to do Section 5 recommendations for federal waters? If we do, I'd be happy to make a motion.
Yeah, if there are any changes that people want to those recommendations, now would be the time to bring those up.
I have Adam Nowalski and then Peter Burns. I don't have Adam. You already spoke. Peter.
I think my question's already been answered. I just thought we were going to go through Section 5 as well, so I think I'm good right now. Thank you.
Emerson, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do we need to do anything about sampling, Section 3?
Again, if the board wants to make changes to those sections based on the public comment, you're welcome to. Now would be the time to do so. So I think this is kind of an opportunity to make additional changes to the addendum as it currently reads. So I'll just remind everyone the 3 federal recommendations are for the creation of a fixed gear VTR form, for the establishment of a harvester reporting requirement for the federal lobster permit holders, and for implementation of a targeted lobster sampling program in federal waters. Dan just mentioned the recommendation for 100% reporting as soon as practical. So if that is a change that the statement that the board wants to make, it seems like that's on the record, but maybe we can just get a nod that that is what everyone is in agreement about.
Peter Burns.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. These are some very ambitious and expensive recommendations in Section 5, but the National Marine Fisheries Service understands the need for the data and the need to make the required adjustments to the way we sample and require reporting. I'll probably abstain on this part of it just because of the nature of the recommendations. But we had a very fruitful discussion about how to go about reporting with that motion that's on the table that we just approved that pertains to the states. Dan made the point that we should implement 100% harvester reporting for the feds as soon as possible or as soon as practicable. I think that since we're really in lockstep with the states through the ACCSP, with our own data programs here at NOAA Fisheries, that it makes sense to really move forward with this hand in hand. So I think we could live with a similar approach that has been approved by the board for the states on the federal side, and then we can work together to develop the systems we need to do and also have the option for some kind of an optimal program if in the interim that makes sense. I don't know if it does, but that's something that we can look into. And a lot of these things we'll need to look into. The sampling, that's a big jump from what we've got. We don't have any additional funding to cover extended observer programs and things like that. So if the board does move forward with those recommendations, I hope that we can work with the states and with the industry to try to plug the gaps as needed given the financial constraints on expanding an observer program. Thank you.
Pat Kelleher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Has the technical committee looked at this issue as it pertains to statistical viability? I mean, on the federal side, on reporting, is there any concerns been raised on the technical committee side associated with the reporting?
Yeah, I don't believe that has been done. That can be done. For the report that came to the board in October, it was based on strictly looking at 3 samples per stat area quarter year combination. So no, it's not been done.
Once again, Section 3, Section 5, if we don't have any changes. Recommended motions? Doug Rowe.
I'd like to make a motion to approve the addendum as modified today.
Second by Dave Borden. Discussion? I think we've had plenty already. Okay, this is a roll call vote. I'll give you 3 minutes. 30 seconds? I'll give him 3 minutes. Go ahead, Peter.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So I guess getting back to my question, maybe I lumped too many things into that last statement that I made. But right now it says in this Section 5 that NIFS will have to report at the level determined by the Commission. And so since that previous motion that we just approved has to do with the states, I mean, is there something more explicit that the board is going to say in this particular section to talk about the level of federal reporting? Is it something that we can do consistent with what has been approved for the states?
My understanding, Peter, is that right now the recommendation coming from the board to GARFO is to implement 100% reporting, as soon as practical for federal vessels, and that there's a clear indication that electronic reporting is where this fishery is moving.
Does that answer your question, Peter?
I don't think it's exactly clear in the document. I mean, I understand it in concept, and those comments were made on the record, but Section 5 doesn't say that.
Correct. Section 5 would have to be updated. Right now, it says to the percentage approved by the board or recommended by the board. So I would fill that in as what the board has said today, and then we'll send a letter to you guys with the specific statements.
Go ahead, Peter, and then we've got a vote here.
It's been a long morning. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I just have one more thing. I want to make sure we're all walking away with the same idea in mind. So I just, so I think if so, would it be, so if NIPS move forward in a manner that's consistent with what the states have been required to do now in this last motion, is that amenable to the board? Is that a reasonable approach, or am I missing something?
I will be corrected if I say this wrong, but I would think if you move forward in something that is under the guidelines we just set up, it would be acceptable to the board. David Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, in terms of the federal waters issue here, you know, I think we got to be clear and have this on the record. This is more and more becoming a federal waters fishery. All you have to do is look at the state of Maine, look at what's happening in southern New England and down in the mid. The traditional inshore fisheries are evaporating, and the industry is moving offshore. So I think there has to be a lot more focus on the part of the federal agencies and federal funding sources to try to address this. I would urge them to go to 100% federal reporting as soon as possible. They certainly have the capabilities to do that. I think we're talking about 1,000 boats that would potentially fall into that category. And as far as the data elements in this, in terms of the fishery-dependent sampling and the port sampling and these types of activities, this information is critical from the assessment side of it. And so we need fiscal resources to be brought to bear on some of these problems. We're talking about a fishery that the dockside value is probably worth $750 million, and we have at least 10,000 boats licensed in the fishery. It's the most valuable fishery on the coast, and yet we have, as our technical committee has pointed out, we have these huge data gaps in the stock assessment for federal waters. These have to be resolved. They can be resolved by our partners in the federal government doing the work. They can also be resolved by bringing some congressional funds into the mix, or having our federal partners fund activities similar to the foundation work where the fishermen are collecting the information. But delaying action on this is the wrong strategy as far as I'm concerned. We should accelerate implementation of this if we can possibly do it. We need to fix these holes in the stock assessment because the consequences are so great for the coastal communities. We have to get on with this.
Thank you, David. Dan? And then we've got a vote on the table here. We were caucusing.
I get that. Just briefly, my intent is not to have the states unload the burden of their federal reporting boats back to NIMS. So I hope when NIMS assesses the cost of what it's going to take to comply with this, they don't think that that's the outcome. I think we can work cooperatively. You know, my state, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, we already have a mandatory trip-level reporting for federal boats that don't fill out VTRs, and I don't think any of us are looking to unload that burden in order to get a 100% achieved. So maybe the states and NIMS can work cooperatively and they can cherry pick the missing boats, and the cost would be far less.
I'm just going to, not to delay this process further, but we need to choose an implementation date. So we've chosen the 5-year timeline for the reporting percentage, but for the harvester reporting elements as well as the spatial resolution. Is the idea that that would also be with that 5-year timeline, or is it on a sooner timeline?
Is everyone ready to vote?
I need an implementation deadline.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was caucusing while you were doing that. We do need an implementation deadline on the record for this vote. Adam's hand is up.
An implementation deadline, as I would expect it would work at this point, given we have put a 5-year backstop on the reporting, would mean that clock would begin not today, but at whatever our implementation date is for this document, correct?
Yes. Doug Rout.
But the other concepts are the data elements and also the optimal optimization for states that have less than 100% until such time as we get in place, get the electronic reporting and the 100% in place. So I'm going to throw out a date, and I'm more than willing to modify it unless if the state of Maine feels this is too aggressive, or any other states. But I would say January 1st, 2019.
Okay, so we have a date. Is there any opposition to the date? Good. Are we ready to vote, knowing the date? Looks like it. We have consensus on the date. We'll consider that approved. On the roll call vote, State of Maine.
Yes.
New Hampshire.
Yes.
Massachusetts.
Yes.
Rhode Island.
Yes.
Connecticut.
Yes.
New York.
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't mean to laugh. New Jersey.
Yes.
Delaware.
Yes.
Maryland.
Yes.
Virginia.
Yes.
National Marine Fisheries Service.
Abstain.
Motion passes 10 in favor, 1 abstention.
11 in favor.
Thank you, Terry. We're back to Megan for Southern New England Work Group.
All right, so switching gears here to the Southern New England Work Group. At annual meeting, the board tasked this work group with reviewing the goals and objectives by which the Southern New England stock is managed. This was prompted by the board's ongoing discussion regarding future management of the stock and concerns that the Southern New England stock may not be rebuilt to historic levels. That work group met via conference call on January 22nd to discuss the applicability of these current goals and objectives. And some of the questions that the group talked about are the current goals and objectives still applicable? Are there other or additional objectives that would be more applicable? And do we need separate objectives for the Southern New England versus the Gulf of Maine Georges Bank stocks? So in their review of these existing goals and objectives, the work group found that some goals and objectives are still pertinent. So as an example, one of the goals in the FMP is to ensure that changes in the geographic exploitation patterns do not undermine success of the management program. So that is still a pertinent goal. But other objectives may no longer be germane given the board's concern over the ability to rebuild the Southern New England stock. As an example, the goal to minimize the risk of stock depletion and recruitment failure. As a result, the Southern New England work group concluded that the goals and objectives may need to be updated to address current issues in the fishery. And in addition, the work group concluded that while it's valuable to have a set of overarching goals for the lobster fishery, it may also be appropriate to have further refined goals specific to the two biological stocks. So I'm not going to read all of these objectives given the time, but there are all of these objectives can be found in the memo from the Southern New England work group, and there are two sets of them. There are ones that could be applicable to both stocks, and then there's ones that could be applicable just to the Southern New England stock. So some of the themes here are looking at dynamics between the inshore-offshore stock, programs to reduce latent effort and manage active effort, promoting consistency of regulations and regulatory timelines, promoting sampling, investigating stock connectivity, and then switching to those that are more applicable to the Southern New England stock, given the apparent negative impacts of climate change, enhancing the protection of spawning stock biomass for lobster, scaling the size of the Southern New England fishery to the diminished size of the Southern New England resource, managing the Southern New England stock as a multi-species fishery, and evaluating the reference points for Southern New England based on the current state of the environment. So moving forward from this discussion, there are several things for the board to consider. Changes to the goals and objectives in Amendment 3 will require an amendment. And as a result, the board needs to consider its desire to undertake such an action, keeping in mind that we do have an ongoing benchmark stock assessment. We have pending action on draft addendum 27, which is still being developed, as well as many discussions regarding protected resources. In addition, if the board is considering changes to the goals and objectives in Amendment 3, it may be pertinent to include representatives from that Gulf of Maine Georges Bank stock in future discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Questions for Megan? We burnt out already? Do you see any hands? Does anybody have a motion based on what you just heard? What's that? We have no further tasking. On to agenda item 6. I'm sorry, did have a hand go up? David.
Before we leave this item, I think the committee is, excuse me, I think the committee has done its work on this, but I just remind everybody, as Megan just indicated, there are things that are ongoing that are going to have a direct bearing on what we might ultimately include in an amendment. For instance, the last 3 lines on the board here, addendum 27 in the benchmark stock assessment. When we get into the terms of reference for that stock assessment, it addresses some of the issues that have been raised by the subcommittee. And I think more importantly, we're going to have this whole discussion about resiliency of on the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank stock, and how to beef up resilience there. So I think this is going to kind of unfold over like a period of a year maybe, and at that point we'll have I think, some different suggestions for goals and objectives on the Gulf of Maine Georgia's stock, which we could incorporate into this. And we'd also have some more technical guidance as a benchmark stock assessment develops that we could fold into it. And then at that point, we decide to go forward with an addendum. But my long-term view is we have fundamental objectives that apply to all of the lobster stocks, and then kind of area-specific objectives that can be tailor-made to meet the requirements in the two areas. Thank you.
Doug Rowe.
So with that being said, modification of the goals and objectives will require an amendment, but our addendum 27 to try and build resilience is an addendum, and it sounded almost like you were describing that we should change the goals and objectives while we're doing addendum 27. So you're saying go through addendum 27 and then address changes to the goals and objective of the plan?
Go ahead, David.
I think addendum 27 is going to shine some light on the issue of what we can do for resiliency, and that may have a direct bearing on what we would incorporate into an amendment. So I'm thinking of this in sequence. I don't think we necessarily have the staff time and resources to go forward with another amendment at this point, and it might be somewhat less than productive to do it now, as we need that input from these other discussions. Thank you.
Joe Cimino.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with everything David just said. I was just wondering if the working group was kind of aware of that, if they had any concerns that this might be on the other side of 2020 before we got to it.
The work group didn't specify a timeline for these future actions, so it's not something we necessarily discussed, but there's also no deadline that they suggested.
Here we go. Review and consider approval of 2020 American Lobster Stock Assessment. Action.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is my first time addressing this board. I'm Jeff Kipp. I'm the commission science staff that will be working on the upcoming lobster assessment. And so I'm here to present the TORs for that assessment for board consideration and approval. So I'll read through these rather quickly. They went out in meeting materials, so in hopes that everyone's had a chance to look through these. So for the stock assessment, we have estimate catch and catch at length from all appropriate fishery-dependent data sources, including commercial and potential discard data, provide descriptions of each data source, discuss data strengths and weaknesses and their potential effects on the assessment, justify inclusion or elimination of each data source, explore improved methods for calculating catch at length matrix, present the abundance data being considered and or used in the assessment, characterize uncertainty in these sources of data, justify inclusion or elimination of each data source, describe calculation or standardization of abundance indices, evaluate new information on life history, such as growth rates, size at maturation, natural mortality rate, and migrations, identify, describe, and if possible, quantify environmental climatic drivers, use length-based models to estimate population parameters for each stock unit and analyze model performance, evaluate stability of model, perform and present model diagnostics, perform sensitivity analyses to examine implications of important model assumptions, including but not limited to growth and natural mortality, explain model strengths and limitations, justify choice of CVs, effective sample sizes, or likelihood weighting schemes, state assumptions made and explain the likely effects of assumption violations on synthesis of input data and model outputs, conduct projections assuming uncertainty in current and future conditions for all stocks, compare projections retrospectively with updated data. Update and develop simple empirical indicator-based trend analyses of reference abundance, effective exploitation, and develop environmental drivers for stock areas. update the current exploitation and abundance reference points, explore and, if possible, develop alternative reference points and reference periods that may account for changing productivity regimes due to environmental effects. Characterize uncertainty of model estimates, reference points, and stock status. Perform retrospective analyses, assess magnitude and direction of retrospective patterns detected, and discuss implications of any observed retrospective patterns for uncertainty in population parameters and reference points. Report stock status as related to overfishing and depleted reference points. Include simple description of the historical and current condition of the stock in layman's terms. Address and incorporate to the extent possible recommendations from the 2015 benchmark peer review. Develop detailed short and long-term prioritized lists of recommendations for future research, data collection, and assessment methodology. Highlight improvements to be made by next benchmark review. Recommend timing of next benchmark assessment and intermediate updates, if necessary, relative to biology and current management of the species. So now I'll move into the terms of reference for the peer review panel, and these are quite similar to what I just went through, but just for the peer review to evaluate the work done by the Stock Assessment Subcommittee and Technical Committee. Evaluate thoroughness of data collection and presentation and treatment of fishery-dependent and fishery-independent data in the assessment, including the following but not limited to: consideration of data strengths and weaknesses, justification for inclusion or elimination of available data sources, calculation of catch-at-length matrix, calculation and or standardization of abundance indices. Evaluate the methods and models used to estimate population parameters and reference points for each stock, including but not limited to use of available life history information to parameterize the model, model parameterization and specification, the choice and justification of the preferred model. Was the most appropriate model used given available data and life history of the species? Evaluate the identification and characterization of environmental climatic drivers. Evaluate the estimates of stock abundance and exploitation from the assessment for use in management. If necessary, specify alternative estimation methods. Evaluate the methods used to characterize uncertainty and estimated parameters where the implications of uncertainty and technical conclusions clearly stated. Evaluate the diagnostic analyses performed, including but not limited to sensitivity analyses to determine model stability and potential consequences of major model assumptions, retrospective analysis. Evaluate the preparation and interpretation of indicator-based analyses for stocks and substock areas. Evaluate the current and recommended reference points and the methods used to estimate them. Recommend stock status determination from the assessment or specify alternative methods. Review the research, data collection, and assessment methodology recommendations provided by the technical committee and make any additional recommendations warranted. Clearly prioritize the activities needed to inform and maintain the current assessment and provide recommendations to improve the reliability of future assessments. Review the recommended timing of the next benchmark assessment relative to the life history and current management of the species. And prepare a peer review panel TOR and advisory report summarizing the panel's evaluation of the stock assessment and addressing each peer review term of reference. Develop a list of tasks to be completed following the workshop. Complete and submit the report within 4 weeks of workshop conclusion. And then up here I just have an abbreviated version of the assessment schedule with the in-person meetings. So we met in November where we developed these TORs. Today we're presenting the terms of reference, and then we have 3 in-person workshops tentatively scheduled to invite researchers and review monitoring data, and that's been scheduled for May 14th through the 17th. We'll have a data and assessment workshop in January 2019, and a final assessment workshop tentatively scheduled for September 2019. With a peer review workshop anticipated in May of 2020, and we anticipate presenting the results of that assessment and peer review to this board in August 2020. And so, are there any questions on the TORs or schedule? I can take those now.
Thank you, Jeff. Any questions for Jeff? If a hand's up, you're going to have to move it because I can't see it. Pat, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have a question, but I have a motion, if it's needed to be done in a motion, for 2 inclusions into the terms of reference.
We're not sure it needs to be, put them up, put them up.
I'm probably the only one getting thousands of emails around Menhaden today, so my computer was a little clogged. In talking with my staff, I think a couple of things that are missing. One is evaluate the implications of habitat expansion or contraction on population productivity. Certainly in southern New England, lobster habitat likely has contracted and reduced the potential of lobster populations. In the reverse, within the Gulf of Maine, we seem to have an expansion of habitat based on warming waters. So I think some exploration into that is certainly appropriate. And then the second one would be to review evidence of stock boundaries in associated stock structures and confirm the current stock units are appropriate. I think hopefully that's self-evident, but if it, that would be completed in a motion.
Do we have a second to include that? Mr. Cimino, I'm sorry.
It happens all the time in the South. You're fine.
Pat, do you feel you need further explanation on that, or shall I go to questions? Any questions on? Jay, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to state up front, I like both of these additions. My concern is, having gone through the lobster stock assessment, it's an enormous amount of work. Concerned about them. The last time we did this, it was, I don't know, delayed because the committees kept getting tasked with additional things. And so I'm wondering if we should keep the terms of reference as Jeff presented them, because my fear in particular from number one, that would be adding a work element that would take time away from getting the assessment completed. Number two, I think, is already kind of implicit in one of the terms of reference, so I'm not as opposed to that one. But the first one, I'm just concerned about adding work to an already enormous workload for this committee and delaying the outcome of the assessment, which is already going to be a couple years past the end date of the data that they have available.
Any other questions or statements? Okay, we're going to have to vote on whether to include this or not, and then we'll move forward on whether we approve the terms of reference with or without these. That's the next two steps. Go ahead, Pat.
So I certainly appreciate Jay's comments on this. However, I really, even though there is a lot of work associated with it, the changes in productive habitat within the Gulf of Maine is a contributing factor to stock structure and the health of the resource going forward. And I really think it should be included in the workload. And if there are other things that maybe fall out, maybe they come back to us on that. But it should be part of the discussions.
Hearing little dissension, I'm going to try this by consensus. All of these in favor, all those in favor of including these two into, I want to say the right term, the terms of reference. So is anyone opposed? Rhode Island? Everyone else is in favor. So we have consensus -1. So I guess we need a roll call vote because we didn't get consensus. No?
Ask. Show of hands, yeah.
Okay, show of hands. Who's in favor? All states, please raise your right hand. and governmental organizations. All opposed? We got to count? Abstentions? Null votes? Motion passes 10-1-0-0. Now, we have to approve the terms of reference as amended, which means we've included these two. Any further discussion? All in favor? Raise your right hands. Opposed? Abstentions? Null votes? You got to count? 11-0-0. Unanimous with no abstentions, no null votes. We're on to the next item. We need a vice chair. Doug Grout.
I move to nominate Dan McKiernan.
Does anyone move to close nominations? No. Is there a second? Pat Kelleher. Any other nominations? All in favor of Dan as the vice chair? Sorry, Dan. Okay, other business. Pat Kelleher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not going to go into specifics because it does pertain to right whales, but there has been a lot of conversation in regards to this fishery, the lobster fishery, as it pertains to ropeless fishing. I would like to task the Law Enforcement Committee with investigating the enforceability of the lobster fishery as it relates to ropeless fishing.
No. Okay. Do we need to vote on that?
Nope.
Is there any other business? Peter Burns.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick update on a motion that was approved by the board at the last meeting. And the motion was to have NIMS in the states of New York and New Jersey get together and talk about the discrepancies with the Area 4 seasonal closure. And I just wanted to inform the board that I've been in contact with staff from New York and New Jersey Fish and Game, and we're meeting on February 26th to have a interim meeting to see how to move forward on this.
Thank you, Peter. Anything else? We are adjourned.